The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as guard Thomas Williams adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day. At 58 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for over 3 decades, standing at attention through countless ceremonies, state visits, and quiet family moments. His weathered hands, marked by years of service, gripped his ceremonial rifle. As he took his position outside the palace's east wing, Thomas had always prided himself on being invisible yet essential. The royal children would pass by his post daily, and while protocol demanded he remain stoic and silent, he couldn't help but notice their growth over the years. Prince George, now 11 years old, had evolved from a curious toddler who once tried to peek behind Thomas's tall black hat into a thoughtful young boy who always offered a polite nod. When their paths crossed on this particular Tuesday morning, Thomas felt an unusual heaviness in his chest. The previous evening, he had received a phone call that changed everything. His younger brother David, who lived in Scotland, had suffered a severe heart attack. The doctors weren't optimistic about his recovery, and David's wife had pleaded with Thomas to come immediately. "He keeps asking for you," she had whispered through tears over the phone. Thomas had requested emergency leave through proper channels. But the palace was preparing for an important diplomatic visit from the Japanese ambassador. His supervisor, Captain Morrison, had reluctantly denied the request, explaining that they couldn't spare any guards during such a critical time. Thomas understood the reasoning, but his heart ached with every passing hour. David wasn't just his brother. He was his closest friend and the only family Thomas had left after their parents passed away. Years earlier, as Thomas stood at his post, his mind wandered to childhood memories of him and David building tree houses in their grandmother's backyard, racing bicycles down country lanes, and making promises to always be there for each other. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he had dedicated his life to protecting and serving others, he couldn't be there when his own brother needed him most. The palace corridors began to fill with the gentle sounds of morning routines. Staff members hurried past with breakfast trays, and the familiar click of heels on marble announced the arrival of various officials preparing for the day ahead. Thomas forced himself to focus on his duties, knowing that displaying emotion while on guard would be highly inappropriate. Around 10 o'clock, he heard the distinctive sound of young voices approaching from the inner courtyard. Prince George appeared with his tutor, Mr. Henderson, carrying what looked like a geography project. As they walked past Thomas's position, Prince George suddenly stopped and looked directly at the guard. There was something different in the young prince's expression, a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," Prince George said quietly, using the guard's name for the first time in all their encounters. Thomas was surprised that the prince even knew his name. As royal protocol typically maintained formal distance between family members and security personnel, Thomas responded with his standard formal nod. But Prince George lingered for a moment, studying the guard's face with genuine concern. "Are you feeling quite well today?" the young prince asked, his voice carrying an unexpected note of compassion. The simple question caught Thomas completely off guard. In 30 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked about his personal well-being. He managed to maintain his composure and replied with the standard response, "Very well, thank you, Your Royal Highness." But Prince George didn't move along as expected. Instead, he exchanged a meaningful glance with his tutor, who seemed to understand some unspoken communication. The prince took a small step closer to Thomas, lowering his voice so only the guard could hear. "Sometimes when people are worried about someone they love, it shows in their eyes," Prince George said with remarkable insight. "My grandmother taught me that recognizing when others are struggling is an important part of being a good person." Thomas felt his throat tighten at the unexpected kindness. The fact that this young boy had not only noticed his distress but had taken the time to acknowledge it with such maturity was overwhelming. For a brief moment, the strict barriers between royal protocol and human connection seemed to dissolve. Prince George excused himself from his tutor and walked to a nearby window alcove, gesturing for Thomas to follow at a discreet distance. Breaking protocol in such a way would normally be unthinkable. But something in the young prince's demeanor suggested this was no ordinary conversation. "Mr. Williams," Prince George began, his voice carrying the weight of someone far older than his 11 years, "I've been learning about leadership in my studies, and my father always says that a true leader listens to people, especially when they can't ask for help themselves." Thomas remained silent, unsure of how to respond to such an unexpected turn in their interaction. Prince George continued, "I noticed you've seemed different these past few days. You still stand perfectly straight and do your job wonderfully, but your eyes look sad. My mother taught me that sometimes the bravest people are the ones who are hurting the most, because they feel they have to be strong for everyone else." The accuracy of Prince George's observation left Thomas speechless. How could this young boy, raised in privilege and luxury, understand the internal struggle of someone like him? Yet here was Prince George, demonstrating an emotional intelligence that many adults lacked. "I don't want to pry into your personal affairs," Prince George said carefully. "But if there's something troubling you, perhaps there's a way to help. My grandmother always said that no one should have to choose between duty and family, especially when someone has served as faithfully as you have." Thomas felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. The mention of family struck directly at his heart, where worry about his brother David continued to consume his thoughts. He had spent the entire night lying awake, checking his phone every few minutes for updates from David's wife, praying that his brother would pull through until Thomas could find a way to reach him. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas began hesitantly, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "my younger brother is very ill in Scotland. The doctors say he may not have much time, and he's been asking for me. I've requested leave, but with the Japanese ambassador's visit, there simply aren't enough guards available." Prince George nodded solemnly, absorbing every word with the seriousness of someone much older. "What's your brother's name?" he asked. "David, Your Highness. David Williams. He's a school teacher in Edinburgh, and he's always been there for me throughout my life. We promised each other as children that we'd never let the other face difficult times alone." The young prince was quiet for several moments, clearly thinking deeply about what he had heard. Thomas could see the wheels turning in Prince George's mind, and there was something about his expression that suggested he was formulating some kind of plan. "Mr. Williams," Prince George said finally, "how long would you need to be with your brother?" Thomas was surprised by the question. "I suppose just a day or two, Your Highness. Enough time to be there for him and to make sure he knows he's not alone. But I understand the impossibility of the situation with current staffing requirements." Prince George looked thoughtful again, then asked, "If you could go to your brother, would you return to your duties afterward?" "Without question, Your Highness. This palace has been my home and my purpose for 30 years. I would return as soon as possible." The young prince smiled for the first time during their conversation, and Thomas could see a spark of determination in his eyes that reminded him remarkably of Prince William's expressions during decisive moments. "Mr. Williams, I want you to know that what you've shared with me will be handled with the utmost discretion and care. Sometimes solutions exist that we don't immediately see, especially when people work together with good intentions." Thomas wasn't entirely sure what Prince George meant by this cryptic statement, but there was something reassuring about the boy's confident demeanor. The guard had expected their conversation to end with polite sympathy and nothing more. But Prince George seemed to be suggesting that something more substantial might be possible. "I should return to my studies now," Prince George said, glancing toward his waiting tutor, "but I want you to know that your dedication to this family and your love for your brother are both admirable qualities. Sometimes the right thing to do requires a bit of creative thinking." As Prince George walked back toward Mr. Henderson, Thomas felt a strange mixture of hope and confusion. The young prince had listened with remarkable maturity and had responded with genuine compassion, but Thomas couldn't imagine what, if anything, could actually change his situation. Still, something about Prince George's confident manner suggested that their conversation was far from over. Later that afternoon, Prince George found himself in the palace library with his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, during their regularly scheduled tea time. These weekly meetings had become precious to both of them, offering the young prince guidance and the queen a chance to share her wisdom with the future king. "Grandmother," Prince George began carefully as he stirred honey into his tea, "I've been thinking about something important, and I would value your advice." Queen Elizabeth, now in her late 90s but still sharp as ever, set down her delicate china cup and gave her great-grandson her full attention. "What's troubling you, George?" "It's about loyalty and duty," Prince George said, choosing his words thoughtfully. "In my studies, I've learned that great leaders sometimes have to make difficult decisions when different loyalties seem to conflict with each other." The Queen's eyes sparkled with interest. She had always been impressed by Prince George's thoughtful nature and his ability to grasp complex concepts despite his young age. "Can you give me a specific example of what you mean?" Prince George took a deep breath before continuing. "What would you do if someone who had served our family faithfully for many years was facing a personal crisis, but duty and protocol seemed to prevent them from handling that crisis properly?" Queen Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, recognizing that this was more than a theoretical question. Her decades of experience had taught her to read between the lines when members of her family approached her with careful, indirect inquiries. "George," she said gently, "are you speaking about someone in particular?" Prince George nodded slowly. "Yes, grandmother. One of our guards, Mr. Williams, has served us for 30 years without ever missing a day or showing anything but complete dedication. But his brother is very sick in Scotland and may be dying. And he can't get leave because of staffing requirements for the Japanese ambassador's visit." The Queen was silent for several moments, considering both the situation and the fact that her great-grandson had noticed and cared enough to bring it to her attention. "How did you come to know about Mr. Williams' situation?" "I could see that something was troubling him," Prince George explained. "He still performed his duties perfectly, but there was sadness in his eyes that reminded me of how I felt when great-grandfather Philip was ill. I asked him about it, and he told me about his brother." Queen Elizabeth felt a surge of pride at her great-grandson's compassion and perceptiveness. "And what do you think should be done about this situation?" Prince George leaned forward earnestly. "I believe that someone who has given 30 years of loyal service has earned the right to be with his dying brother, even if it's inconvenient for us. Wouldn't it be wrong to let protocol prevent basic human kindness?" The Queen smiled at the young prince's moral clarity. "You're absolutely correct, George. But tell me, have you thought about how such a situation might be resolved practically?" Prince George's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who had indeed been thinking about practical solutions. "I was wondering if perhaps one of the retired guards might be willing to fill in temporarily? Or maybe some of the current guards could work longer shifts for just a day or two. I know it would require some adjustments. But surely Mr. Williams' 3 decades of faithful service have earned him that consideration." Queen Elizabeth was deeply impressed not just by her great-grandson's compassion, but by his practical thinking. "George, these are very thoughtful suggestions. But I'm curious about something else. Why did you bring this to me rather than speaking to your parents or to Captain Morrison directly?" Prince George considered the question carefully. "Because I remember you telling me that sometimes the most important decisions require someone who can see the bigger picture beyond immediate concerns. You always say that leadership means understanding the difference between what's merely convenient and what's truly right." The Queen reached across the small table and placed her weathered hand on Prince George's young one. "My dear boy, you've demonstrated wisdom far beyond your years today. The ability to notice suffering, the courage to inquire about it, and the determination to seek solutions are all qualities that will serve you well throughout your life." Prince George felt a warm glow of pride at his grandmother's approval, but he was more focused on the practical matter at hand. "So you think it would be right to help Mr. Williams?" "I think it would be more than right," Queen Elizabeth replied with conviction. "I think it would be essential. Someone who has dedicated their life to protecting our family deserves to have that loyalty reciprocated when they need it most. The Queen paused thoughtfully before continuing. George, I'm going to share something with you that I hope you'll remember for the rest of your life. True leadership isn't about having power over people. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up when they need it most. Mr. Williams has spent 30 years putting our needs before his own. Now it's time for us to put his needs first. Prince George felt a thrill of excitement and purpose. What shall we do, grandmother? Queen Elizabeth's eyes twinkled with the same mischievous spirit that had guided her through decades of subtle palace maneuvering. Leave that to me, my dear. But I want you to understand that what you've done today, recognizing someone's pain and caring enough to seek a solution, is exactly the kind of leadership our family and our country will need from you in the future. Asterisk within an hour of her conversation with Prince George, Queen Elizabeth had summoned Captain Morrison to her private study. The captain, a stern man in his mid-50s who had overseen palace security for over a decade, appeared promptly and stood at attention before the Queen's desk. Captain Morrison, the Queen began in her characteristic measured tone, I understand that Guard Williams has requested emergency leave to visit his seriously ill brother in Scotland, and that this request has been denied due to staffing concerns regarding tomorrow's diplomatic visit. Captain Morrison shifted slightly, recognizing the subtle but unmistakable tone of royal displeasure. Yes, Your Majesty. With the Japanese ambassador's arrival and the enhanced security protocols required, I felt it necessary to maintain our full complement of guards. Williams has been with us for 30 years, and his reliability is exactly why we need him during such important events. Queen Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, fixing the captain with a steady gaze that had intimidated world leaders for decades. Captain, in your assessment, how many years of faithful service does it take to earn the right to be with one's dying sibling? The directness of the question caught Captain Morrison off guard. He had expected to discuss scheduling logistics, not moral philosophy. Your Majesty, I understand the human element of the situation, but security protocols must take precedence during state visits. I see, the Queen replied coolly. And tell me, Captain, in your years of service, have you ever known Guard Williams to shirk his duties, arrive late, or show anything less than complete dedication? No, Your Majesty. Williams has been exemplary in every aspect of his service. Then help me understand, the Queen continued, her voice growing more pointed, why someone who has given us 3 decades of unwavering loyalty should be forced to choose between his duty to us and his duty to his family in what may be his brother's final hours. Captain Morrison began to realize that this was not a casual inquiry about staffing decisions. Your Majesty, if you're suggesting that we accommodate Williams' request, I would need to find alternative arrangements for security coverage. I'm not suggesting. Captain, Queen Elizabeth said with quiet authority, I'm directing you to find those alternative arrangements immediately. Surely a security force that can protect visiting dignitaries can manage to adjust their schedule for one guard's family emergency? The captain nodded quickly. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll contact retired personnel and arrange for additional shifts among current staff. Excellent, the Queen replied, her tone warming slightly. And Captain, I want you to ensure that Guard Williams understands. This leave is granted with our full support and gratitude for his years of service. He should not feel that his job is in jeopardy or that he's created any inconvenience. Understood, Your Majesty. I'll speak with him immediately. As Captain Morrison prepared to leave, Queen Elizabeth added one final instruction. Oh, and Captain, I want you to arrange for palace transportation to take Guard Williams to Scotland. A man who has spent 30 years protecting our family shouldn't have to worry about travel logistics when rushing to his brother's bedside. Captain Morrison saluted crisply. It will be arranged immediately, Your Majesty. After the captain left, Queen Elizabeth sat quietly in her study, reflecting on the day's events. She thought about Prince George's compassion and moral clarity, traits that gave her great hope for the future of the monarchy. The boy had demonstrated that he understood something crucial about leadership, that true power lies not in the ability to command others, but in the wisdom to know when to use that power for kindness. Meanwhile, Prince George was in his room, supposedly working on homework, but actually watching the clock and wondering what his grandmother might have set in motion. He had learned enough about palace operations to know that when Queen Elizabeth decided something should happen, it typically happened swiftly and efficiently. Around 5 o'clock that evening, Prince George heard familiar footsteps in the corridor outside his room. He opened his door to find Thomas Williams walking past in civilian clothes, carrying a small travel bag. The guard looked transformed, the heavy sadness that had weighed down his features that morning had been replaced by relief and gratitude. "Mr. Williams," Prince George called softly. Thomas stopped and turned, his face breaking into a smile when he saw the young prince. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Prince George replied earnestly. "I just hope you reach your brother in time and that he recovers." Thomas's eyes misted slightly. "Because of your kindness and your grandmother's generosity, I'll be able to keep the promise I made to my brother when we were children. That means more to me than I can possibly express." Prince George felt a warm satisfaction spreading through his chest. "That's what family is for, Mr. Williams, and after 30 years of protecting our family, you're part of ours too?" The simple statement from the 11-year-old prince carried a profound truth that touched Thomas deeply. He had always thought of his service in professional terms, but Prince George's words helped him understand that he had indeed become part of something larger than a job or duty. The palace-arranged car pulled up to Edinburgh Royal Infirmary just as the sun was setting behind the Scottish hills. Thomas Williams had spent the entire 3-hour journey alternating between prayer and worry, checking his phone repeatedly for updates from his sister-in-law, Margaret. The last text he had received simply said, "He's asking for you again. Please hurry." Thomas rushed through the hospital corridors, his civilian clothes feeling strange after decades of wearing his uniform during moments of urgency. When he finally reached the cardiac intensive care unit, he found Margaret sitting in a chair beside David's bed, holding her husband's hand while machines beeped steadily around them. David looked smaller than Thomas remembered, his face pale against the white hospital pillows, but his eyes were alert and focused. When he saw his older brother enter the room, David's face lit up with relief and joy. "Tommy," David whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "I knew you'd come." Thomas moved to the opposite side of the bed and took his brother's other hand, feeling how fragile it seemed compared to the strong hands he remembered from their youth. "Of course I came, little brother. I made you a promise a long time ago, remember?" David smiled weakly. "We'd always be there for each other when it mattered most. I wasn't sure if you'd be able to get away from the palace." "Let me tell you about that," Thomas said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Something remarkable happened that you need to hear about." Over the next hour, Thomas told David and Margaret about Prince George's extraordinary perceptiveness and kindness, about how the young prince had noticed Thomas's distress and cared enough to ask about it. He described the compassionate conversation they had shared and how Prince George had somehow managed to arrange for Thomas's emergency leave through Queen Elizabeth herself. David listened with growing amazement. "An 11-year-old prince did all that for you?" "Not just for me," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "For you too, David." He understood that this was about family, about promises between brothers, about love being more important than protocol. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the story. "Tommy, in 30 years of hearing about your work at the palace, you've never told us anything like this." "Because nothing like this has ever happened," Thomas admitted. "The royal family has always been respectful and proper, but this was different. This was personal kindness from a child who could have easily ignored the troubles of a palace guard." As the evening progressed, Thomas was relieved to see that David's condition seemed to be stabilizing. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, and David's spirits were clearly lifted by having his brother beside him. They talked about their childhood, their parents, and their shared memories, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of brotherhood. Around midnight, as David dozed fitfully, Margaret pulled Thomas aside. The doctors say the next 24 hours will be critical. Having you here has already made such a difference in his recovery. He was losing hope before you arrived." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "I'll stay as long as he needs me." Prince George and Queen Elizabeth made sure I understood that my job would be waiting for me when I return, and that this leave was granted with their full support. "It's extraordinary that such young royalty would show such wisdom," Margaret observed. "Prince George reminds me a lot of David when we were children," Thomas reflected. "David always noticed when someone was hurting and always tried to help, even when he was too young to understand the complexities of adult problems." The next morning brought encouraging news from the medical team. David's condition had improved significantly overnight, and while he wasn't out of danger completely, the doctors were much more optimistic about his chances for a full recovery. "Having family support makes an enormous difference in cardiac recovery," Dr. Stewart explained to Thomas and Margaret. "The psychological boost of knowing loved ones care enough to be present can be as healing as our medical interventions." Thomas thought about Prince George's instinctive understanding of this truth. Somehow, an 11-year-old had grasped something that many adults struggle to comprehend, that love and presence are powerful forces for healing, and that no duty or protocol should prevent someone from offering that gift when it's desperately needed. As David grew stronger throughout the day, he kept asking Thomas to repeat the story of Prince George's intervention. "I can't get over it," David said during one of his more alert moments. "A child that young, with that much wisdom and compassion. It gives me hope for the future of the monarchy." Thomas squeezed his brother's hand gently. "It gives me hope for the future of everything. David, if we're raising children who notice suffering and act to relieve it, then we're doing something right in this world." 3 days later, Thomas Williams returned to Kensington Palace with a heart much lighter than the one he had carried when he left. David was out of immediate danger and steadily recovering, and the doctors were confident he would make a full recovery with proper rest and medication. The brothers had spent precious hours together, strengthening bonds that had been stretched by distance and busy lives. As Thomas approached the palace gates in his familiar red uniform, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude dominated his thoughts, but there was also a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve a family that truly cared about their people. His 3 decades of service had suddenly taken on new meaning. Captain Morrison met Thomas at the security checkpoint with an unexpected warmth in his demeanor. "Williams, welcome back. How is your brother?" "Much better, thank you, Captain. The doctors expect a full recovery." "Excellent news," Captain Morrison replied, then added something that surprised Thomas. "I owe you an apology, Williams. I should have found a way to accommodate your request immediately. 30 years of exemplary service should have been enough to override my concerns about protocol." Thomas was taken aback by the admission. "Thank you, Captain, but you were following proper procedures. I understand the complexities of security arrangements." Perhaps," Captain Morrison said thoughtfully, "but sometimes proper procedures need to bend when human decency demands it. Prince George and Queen Elizabeth reminded me of that important distinction." As Thomas returned to his familiar post outside the East Wing, he noticed that several of his fellow guards greeted him with unusual warmth. Word had apparently spread throughout the palace staff about his emergency leave and the royal intervention that had made it possible. "How's your brother doing, Thomas?" asked Guard Peterson, who had worked the double shifts to cover Thomas's absence. "Recovering well, thank you. And thank you for covering my duties. I know it meant extra work for everyone." Peterson waved off the gratitude. "That's what we do for each other, mate. Besides, it was good to see the royal family show such consideration for one of us. Makes you proud to serve, doesn't it?" Later that morning, as Thomas settled back into the familiar rhythms of his post, he heard the approach of light footsteps that he now recognized immediately. Prince George appeared around the corner with his tutor, but today the young prince was carrying something in his hands. "Mr. Williams," Prince George said with a bright smile, "welcome back. How is your brother David?" "He's doing very well, Your Royal Highness. The doctors say he'll make a complete recovery." I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you did. Prince George looked genuinely pleased. I'm so glad he's better. I brought you something. He handed Thomas a small, wrapped package. It's not much, but I thought you might like to have it. Thomas carefully unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful leather bookmark with the royal crest embossed on it, along with a handwritten note in Prince George's careful script. The note read, "For Mr. Williams, who taught me that noticing when others need help is the first step toward being a good leader. Thank you for your 30 years of service and for showing me what true loyalty looks like." Prince George Thomas felt his throat constrict with emotion as he read the words, "Your Royal Highness." 3 days later, Thomas Williams returned to Kensington Palace with a heart much lighter than the one he had carried when he left. David was out of immediate danger and steadily recovering, and the doctors were confident he would make a full recovery with proper rest and medication. The brothers had spent precious hours together, strengthening bonds that had been stretched by distance and busy lives. As Thomas approached the palace gates in his familiar red uniform, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude dominated his thoughts, but there was also a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve a family that truly cared about their people. His 3 decades of service had suddenly taken on new meaning. Captain Morrison met Thomas at the security checkpoint with an unexpected warmth in his demeanor. "Williams, welcome back. How is your brother?" "Much better, thank you, Captain. The doctors expect a full recovery." "Excellent news," Captain Morrison replied, then added something that surprised Thomas. "I owe you an apology, Williams. I should have found a way to accommodate your request immediately. 30 years of exemplary service should have been enough to override my concerns about protocol." Thomas was taken aback by the admission. "Thank you, Captain, but you were following proper procedures." "I understand the complexities of security arrangements." Perhaps," Captain Morrison said thoughtfully, "but sometimes proper procedures need to bend when human decency demands it. Prince George and Queen Elizabeth reminded me of that important distinction." As Thomas returned to his familiar post outside the East Wing, he noticed that several of his fellow guards greeted him with unusual warmth. Word had apparently spread throughout the palace staff about his emergency leave and the royal intervention that had made it possible. "How's your brother doing, Thomas?" asked Guard Peterson, who had worked the double shifts to cover Thomas's absence. "Recovering well, thank you. And thank you for covering my duties. I know it meant extra work for everyone." Peterson waved off the gratitude. "That's what we do for each other, mate. Besides, it was good to see the royal family show such consideration for one of us. Makes you proud to serve, doesn't it?" Later that morning, as Thomas settled back into the familiar rhythms of his post, he heard the approach of light footsteps that he now recognized immediately. Prince George appeared around the corner with his tutor, but today the young prince was carrying something in his hands. "Mr. Williams," Prince George said with a bright smile, "welcome back. How is your brother David?" "He's doing very well, Your Royal Highness. The doctors say he'll make a complete recovery." "I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you did." Prince George looked genuinely pleased. "I'm so glad he's better. I brought you something." He handed Thomas a small, wrapped package. "It's not much, but I thought you might like to have it." Thomas carefully unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful leather bookmark with the royal crest embossed on it, along with a handwritten note in Prince George's careful script. The note read, "For Mr. Williams, who taught me that noticing when others need help is the first step toward being a good leader. Thank you for your 30 years of service and for showing me what true loyalty looks like." Prince George Thomas felt his throat constrict with emotion as he read the words. "Your Royal Highness, this is incredibly thoughtful. But I should be thanking you, not the other way around." "Actually," Prince George said, with the wisdom of someone far beyond his years, "we should both be thankful. You taught me something important about leadership and compassion, and I hope I was able to help you when you needed it most. That's how good relationships work, isn't it?" Thomas marveled at the young prince's insight. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. That's exactly how good relationships work." Prince George glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer to Thomas. My grandmother told me something wonderful yesterday. She said that what happened between us shows that the monarchy can still be relevant and meaningful in people's lives when it's used to help rather than just to command. The profundity of this observation from an 11-year-old left Thomas speechless for a moment. Finally, he managed to say, "Your Royal Highness, if that's the kind of leader you become, then this country will be very fortunate indeed." Prince George beamed at the compliment, then grew more serious. "Mr. Williams, I hope you'll feel comfortable coming to me or my family if you ever need help again. What you've taught me about noticing when people are struggling is too important to forget." As Prince George rejoined his tutor and continued down the corridor, Thomas carefully tucked the bookmark and note into his uniform pocket. He realized that this simple gift represented something far more significant than a token of appreciation. It was a symbol of mutual respect between generations, between different worlds within the same institution, and between a young future king learning about compassion and an experienced guard who had dedicated his life to service. Thomas thought about how he would describe this experience to David during their next phone call. His brother would be amazed to learn that a chance encounter and a moment of vulnerability had led not only to crucial emergency leave, but to a meaningful relationship with the future King of England. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Thomas Williams found himself preparing for a very special day. After 35 years of faithful service to the crown, he was retiring from his position as palace guard. His decision hadn't been made lightly, but David's health scare had reminded him that life was precious, and that he wanted to spend his remaining years closer to his family in Scotland. The retirement ceremony was scheduled to take place in the palace's oak-paneled reception room, with several senior staff members and fellow guards in attendance. What Thomas didn't expect was to see Prince George enter the room alongside Prince William and Queen Elizabeth. Captain Morrison began the formal proceedings by reading a commendation that highlighted Thomas's decades of exemplary service, his perfect attendance record, and his unwavering dedication to protecting the royal family. But when it came time for the presentation of his service medal, Queen Elizabeth herself stepped forward. "Mr. Williams," the Queen began, her voice carrying the authority and warmth that had defined her reign, "it is my distinct honor to recognize not only your 35 years of faithful service, but also your role in teaching my great-grandson one of the most important lessons of his young life." Thomas felt his cheeks redden as the Queen continued. "Through your example of quiet dignity, unwavering loyalty, and deep family love, you have shown Prince George what it truly means to serve others while maintaining one's humanity and values." Queen Elizabeth pinned the service medal to Thomas's civilian jacket, then surprised everyone by stepping back and gesturing for Prince George to come forward. The young prince, now 12 years old and even more poised than he had been 6 months earlier, carried a small wooden box. "Mr. Williams," Prince George said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the room, "this past year you taught me that real leadership means paying attention to people who might not be able to ask for help, and that true strength comes from caring about others even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Prince George opened the wooden box to reveal a beautiful pocket watch, engraved with Thomas's initials and the dates of his service. "This watch belonged to my great-great-grandfather, King George V. My grandmother thought it would be appropriate for you to have it, since you've spent so many years keeping watch over our family." Thomas accepted the watch with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture. "Your Royal Highness, I don't know what to say. This is far too generous." "Actually," Prince George replied with a smile that reminded Thomas remarkably of the boy's father, "my grandmother says it's not nearly enough to repay someone who helped teach a future king about compassion. She also told me that the best gifts are the ones that help us remember important lessons." Prince William stepped forward then, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Mr. Williams, what my son learned from you about noticing when others are in pain and acting to help them is exactly the kind of lesson we hope will shape his character as a future king. Thank you for that gift." As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle over tea and refreshments, Thomas found himself in conversation with several colleagues who had worked alongside him for years. Many of them mentioned how the story of Prince George's intervention had spread throughout the palace staff, becoming a source of inspiration and pride. "It's changed how we all think about our relationship with the family," Guard Henderson observed. "Knowing that they see us as real people with real lives and real problems, not just uniformed furniture, makes the job mean something different." Later, as Thomas was preparing to leave the palace for the final time, Prince George approached him once more, this time without the formal setting of the ceremony. "Mr. Williams," the young prince said, "I wanted you to know that I think about what happened between us quite often. It taught me that being royal doesn't mean being distant from people's problems. It means being close enough to notice them and powerful enough to help solve them." Thomas smiled at the wisdom in those words. "Your Royal Highness, if you remember that lesson throughout your life, you'll be exactly